Okay, nice to be in Bradford again. Can everyone hear me at the back? Okay, so 15 minutes on games auditing and related subjects. So in my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Some of you may know my early work, in particular when I was at IBM in the 80s, through to how the due diligence process works when we go into a company, the types of questions we ask, and to give you insights in how to survive that process and come out on top. Then I'm going to do a quick snapshot on the games industry and sort of related areas, sort of games that cross over into social networking, and give some snapshots into sort of what investors are viewing as hot areas or which areas are dead. Okay. So this basically, the top bit of this frame deals with games audit. So games audit essentially is an operational and technical due diligence company. So what happens is an investment company of the type that Ed works for asks games audit to look at a company. Sometimes they really like it, sometimes they've got a few worries, sometimes they're just generally very nervous about the games industry in the UK, and they want someone to go in and ask all the really hard questions. So we work for a number of clients. Ingenious Ventures, a very smart organisation based in Soho. Do a lot of work for ITI Tech Media in Scotland. Doing work for international film guarantors on completion bonding in games, applying the film model across to games. And other people like Nestor Investments, Imprimatur Capital. Prior to that, I ran a game studio for 10 years, and then prior to that, I worked for IBM. So this is when I was running a game studio. I did lots of haggling with Hollywood, worked with Universal, Virgin, all the obvious people, Microsoft, who were pretty tough to work with, and started a company in an attic in Soho and grew it to about 75 people. Hit games we produced included The Thing for PlayStation 2, which was a great project. We were given carte blanche to do a sequel to the film. The problem was all the characters died at the end of the film, so we had to create a plot that was able to generate the game. So we got involved with John Carpenter and the whole issue of moving licenses from the movie industry across into the game sector. It's #1 hit. This is going back in time, back Evolver, and then before that I worked for IBM in the advanced graphics division, in particular working with Stephen Todd. And this is some of the imagery that some of you who are about my age might be familiar with. And basically the work was quite radical in this idea that the designer becomes like a gardener. They just pick and breed. And this is about 1987, and a sort of more handsome version of myself sitting at a terminal. So these are just some of the visuals, Scientific American. On another front, I'm also a professor at Goldsmiths, as part of the University of London, and I actually am now working on the other side of the fence, a spin-off company to do with synthetic protein folding, using some of the form grow work that we did at IBM, actually applying it to real-world genetics. But that's just a side issue, and in some ways my view is that genetics is the new digital frontier. That's where the real action is going to be. So coming back to games audit, so operational technical due diligence, I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper. So often what happens is that the company in question has built up a very friendly relationship with the potential investor. They've got friendly, the investor has asked sort of quite lightweight questions, and everything's hunky-dory, and everyone thinks, great, $5 million or pounds in the cash in the bank within 6 months. I turn up, and then the whole dimension changes, because I ask them all the questions that they've avoided even talking about, and like a poacher, you're normally a reasonably good gamekeeper. So the type of companies that we cover console game companies, and also we're crossing into interesting areas like digital capture, consumer animation, so McKinemascope products, just done a big project, £7 million worth of investment in a hardware, software deal, university spin-outs, startups, and a lot of business development, actually trying to, if you've got a company, try and knock it into a shape that it's going to be really successful. What's interesting is if you go into a company, normally what happens pretty much, it either takes two directions. Either you ask some pretty hard questions, and the person who's that's receiving the due diligence either gets very upset or actually takes it completely coolly. They can answer the questions, they're not worried. Whatever question you ask, they say, okay, we'll come back to you on that. And it's very different. You have no prediction of what company is going to be successful. In general, the CEOs that keep a very cool head throughout the due diligence process normally are successful. Because normally when you're doing due diligence, you give a few hints at actually what they need to do. So if they haven't got a decent marketing plan, you say, please can you send us the marketing plan as soon as possible, because that's very important. Now, if they haven't got one, a smart company will go and write one. And at the end of the day, no one's any the wiser. So normally with the due diligence process, you give people quite a few cues. Universities are always interesting. I did due diligence on a university where the person who was after the money, after quite a lot of money, fell asleep during the presentation. Quite often, another interesting one was a very interesting case. I can't obviously give the name. A company had produced a piece of software. It was in two parts. The first part worked perfectly. The second part was a fake. They'd mocked it up. They'd hand digitized the whole thing. Anyway, in the first conversation with the investors, who were quite switched on, they showed them both bits. The first bit they showed as a runtime, and they also showed them a second bit. The investor asked as a chance remark, that second bit, that's really exciting, does that work? And the company said they really should have said something different, but they said, yeah, that's working, we have an early prototype. Well, they should have said, this is a mock-up. Anyway, we went through this entire due diligence process, and then the final meeting, I knew they'd faked it and I'd done my research, and they had to confess in front of all these investors. The ridiculous thing was the investors were quite happy just to invest in the first bit of software, the first 50%. They weren't, the other stuff was icing on the cake. But so quite often when you're doing due diligence, you can find yourself in a situation where it's kind of confessional, the company confess to all this stuff. The problem is that they don't confess early. If that had come up in an earlier conversation, it could have been dealt with a lot better. Anyway, so we also look at startups and things like that. The due diligence process normally involves templates. The person receiving the due diligence normally has a clear idea what's required. One of the key things is the business model, and this is more important than the business plan. And normally an accountant has got involved working with the CEO, and the spreadsheet normally has all the key assumptions plugged in. And so the investor, from my experience, normally wants to get hold of that and play with the variables. As I mentioned earlier, there's often opportunity to fix, and the key thing is the CEO. If your CEO within your company is a bit of an idiot, there's just no point going to an investment company because they just won't carry it through. So the CEO is absolutely key, and getting that person right is absolutely fundamental. And also, as was mentioned earlier in one of the talks, having a working prototype, actually proof that it works.